I demand a private room suitable for a man of my elevated station. Do you hear me? I am a general officer of the High Command, and I will absolutely not be treated like a common criminal or a peasant."
The opposing commander's voice, sharp, condescending and biting like the freezing wind howling outside, echoed through the damp, drafty, and ruined stone farmhouse. He stood there in the center of the miserable room, his chin raised in total defiance, his custom-tailored uniform completely untouched by the unspeakable filth of the war that was raging just beyond the wooden doors. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that the legendary General George S. Patton Jr. had just violently kicked open the heavy oak door and was currently standing directly behind him, listening to every single arrogant word. Before we dive deep into the specific, heart-stopping moment where Patton fundamentally broke this aristocratic commander's mind and delivered the ultimate historical reality check, I want you to do something for me. If you believe that true justice means looking the architects of historical tragedy directly in the eye and permanently stripping away their arrogant masks, hit that subscribe button right now and join our community of dedicated history explorers. Tell me down in the comments right now, do you think a captured leader who orchestrated global devastation deserves the traditional, comfortable rights of a gentleman soldier? Or should they be forcefully subjected to the exact same misery they inflicted upon millions of innocent people? Let the debate begin. Now let us travel back to the late afternoon of March 24th, 1945, at precisely 1400 hours, where the iron-gray, suffocating sky over the European theater was bleeding a relentless, icy rain onto a devastated landscape that had become a sprawling graveyard of fallen empires. This was absolutely not the heroic, clean-cut, and glorious version of warfare that you see depicted in vintage recruitment posters or old Hollywood cinematic productions. This was a grim, unforgiving landscape defined by raw, sucking, freezing brown mud that possessed the terrifying ability to swallow heavy transport vehicles and grown men whole. The young American soldiers of the United States Third Army, guys who just a few short years ago were happily fixing automobiles in Detroit, working the vast agricultural fields in Kansas, or teaching mathematics in quiet suburban high schools, were now fundamentally unrecognizable from their former civilian selves. Their heavy olive-drab uniforms were entirely soaked through, weighed down with gallons of freezing rainwater and permanently caked in thick, suffocating layers of heavy European clay. These men had survived the grueling, chaotic, amphibious landings. They had pushed through the dense hedgerows. They had endured the freezing, snowy hellscape of the Ardennes forest during the most bitter winter in recorded history. And now they were wading through the freezing spring mud of a collapsing nation. They slept in flooded artillery craters. They ate cold, tasteless rations out of metal tin cans with hands stained by heavy machine grease and the residue of continuous combat, and they carried an emotional exhaustion that settled so deeply into their bones that it altered the very way they walked. Every single mile gained toward the final objective was paid for in unimaginable physical misery and immense personal sacrifice. The logistical nightmare of moving massive armored columns through a country where the infrastructure had been completely pulverized by relentless aerial bombardment meant that the frontline infantryman was almost always cold, almost always wet, and almost always pushed to the absolute breaking point of human endurance. Yet they moved forward with a gritty, unbreakable determination that defined a generation. It was directly into this exact, miserable, and freezing hellscape that a heavily armored transport vehicle finally arrived at a forward American command post, delivering a newly captured prisoner of war who looked as though he had just been teleported from an entirely different planet. Stepping carefully out of the heavy military vehicle to avoid splashing his boots was a high-ranking aristocrat of the elite opposing command. While the exhausted American guards surrounding him were violently shivering in the damp wind and covered from head to toe in thick muck, this captured officer was absolutely immaculate. His long woolen greatcoat was completely spotless. His silver collar insignia gleamed brilliantly in the dull, overcast afternoon light, and his expensive, custom-crafted leather riding boots were polished to a stunning mirror shine that seemed to openly mock the very mud he was currently being forced to stand in. He was a direct product of an ancient, deeply entrenched Prussian military tradition, a man who had been raised from birth in grand estates to believe that he was a vital part of a superior class, a master race destined by history to rule over the lesser, uncultured populations of the globe. He looked at the young American draftees surrounding him, not as victorious conquerors who had brilliantly outmaneuvered his forces, but as uneducated, inferior mechanics and shopkeepers who had simply overwhelmed his brilliant strategies through sheer, mindless industrial production. He carried an aura of absolute entitlement, an unshakable belief that his noble bloodline and his elevated military rank provided a permanent, impenetrable shield against the degrading, humiliating realities of the conflict he had spent years directing from the comfort of warm, heavily guarded chateaus. As the American military police firmly escorted this pristine commander into the temporary holding area, which was nothing more than a heavily damaged, drafty farmhouse with a collapsed roof and no central heating, the captured officer did not observe the profound suffering around him. He completely ignored the wounded American soldiers being quietly tended to by medics on the freezing stone floor, and he paid absolutely no attention to the hollow, exhausted eyes of the radio operators, desperately trying to keep their equipment dry in the corner of the ruined building. He only saw his own immediate personal inconvenience. He halted in the center of the room, turned to a young, exhausted American captain who hadn't slept in 3 days, and began to issue demands in perfectly articulated, highly educated English. He complained bitterly about the damp, unacceptable conditions of the farmhouse. He loudly expressed his profound disgust at the smell of the common soldiers occupying the same breathing space. He did not ask for a moment to rest or a simple glass of water. He boldly demanded to be taken to a private, heated room suitable for a gentleman of his elevated station. He demanded that his personal leather luggage be brought to him immediately, and he even went so far as to request a specific, high-quality vintage of wine to accompany his evening meal, loudly citing the traditional rules of gentlemanly warfare and international treaties, as if the regime he served had not just spent the last half-decade systematically shredding every single established law of human decency across the continent. The American soldiers in the room simply stopped what they were doing and stared at the man in a state of absolute, stunning disbelief. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the commander's demands caused the temperature in the drafty room to plummet even further. These young men had just spent the last 6 months watching their closest childhood friends fall in the freezing mud, fighting against an opposing force that had shown absolutely no mercy, no honor, and no human compassion to the innocent civilian populations they had conquered, and now, standing right in front of them, was one of the chief architects of that very same brutal tragedy, wearing a spotless, perfectly pressed uniform, complaining about the accommodations, and aggressively demanding luxury room service as if he were checking into a grand hotel in peacetime. The tension in the air became instantly electric, thick enough to cut with a combat knife. The American guards slowly tightened their grips on their heavy rifles, their knuckles turning stark white under the strain, silently, desperately praying for the officer to give them a single justifiable excuse to forcefully wipe that arrogant, superior sneer right off his perfectly shaved face. Before I tell you how this incredibly tense situation was resolved by the arrival of the most feared general in the Allied forces, I want to ask you a serious question about human nature. Have you ever been forced to deal with someone so completely blinded by their own towering ego and overwhelming sense of entitlement that they simply could not see the harsh reality staring them right in the face? If you have ever witnessed a massive, unforgettable reality check in your own life, drop down into the comments right now and write the word reality and share your thoughts. We read your comments, we analyze your perspectives, and we absolutely love the intense historical debate this community brings to every single video. But just before the suffocating tension in that drafty, ruined farmhouse could completely boil over into unauthorized physical retaliation, the atmosphere in the room changed in an instant. The heavy, distinct, and aggressive roar of a massive military engine echoed through the freezing rain outside, followed immediately by the loud, screeching halt of heavy tires violently sliding through the thick, wet clay. The heavy wooden door of the farmhouse was suddenly kicked open with tremendous force, and the freezing wind rushed into the room, bringing with it a man who possessed a physical presence so incredibly intimidating, so overwhelmingly dominant, that it instantly sucked all the available oxygen out of the air. General George S. Patton Jr. had officially arrived on the scene. When Patton stepped into the dim, flickering light of the holding area, he did not look like a polished, bureaucratic aristocrat who spent his days pushing paper in a safe capital city. He looked exactly like a fierce, uncompromising warrior who lived, breathed, and thrived in the dirt and chaos of the front lines. His custom-made cavalry boots were heavily caked in the exact same thick brown European clay that his young foot soldiers marched through every single day. His face was a deeply weathered map of aggressive determination, deeply lined by years of intense stress and relentless forward momentum. And resting heavily on his hips, gleaming dangerously in the dim light of the farmhouse, were his famous trademark ivory-handled revolvers, strapped to his waist not merely as decorative weapons, but as a silent, terrifying warning to anyone who dared to challenge his absolute authority. Patton slowly walked toward the center of the room, the heavy clatter of his boot heels sounding like a hammer striking an anvil against the damp stone floor. He did not say a single word at first. He simply walked up to the captured commander and stood there, completely invading the man's personal space, looking him up and down with a cold, piercing gaze that had the power to peel the paint off a heavily armored tank. Patton possessed a profound, almost tribal loyalty to the young men who fought and bled under his command, and he harbored a deep, burning, and completely unfiltered hatred for the arrogant elite of the opposing high command. He despised the historical reality that the men who orchestrated global tragedies always seemed to find a clever way to insulate themselves from the physical suffering they caused, hiding comfortably behind their high ranks, their polished boots, and their gentlemanly treaties, while the common foot soldiers drowned in the mud. Patton looked intently at the spotless woolen coat. He stared at the shining silver medals, and then he slowly turned his head to look over at his own shivering, mud-stained, deeply exhausted boys huddled in the corner of the room. You could physically see the cold, terrifying fury igniting behind Patton's eyes. This was not a standard military interrogation. This was the moment of the ultimate psychological and philosophical clash between two entirely different worlds. The captured commander, still completely blinded by his own towering ego and assuming he was finally speaking to a fellow member of the elite officer class who would surely understand the vital necessity of maintaining strict social hierarchies, stubbornly repeated his outrageous demands. He demanded a private, heated room, he demanded fresh clothing, and he demanded the honorable treatment he felt was his absolute birthright. He genuinely believed that Patton would sympathize with his plight, that Patton would recognize him as a gentleman and rescue him from the indignity of waiting in a ruined room with the common infantry. He was catastrophically, historically wrong. Patton leaned in until his weathered face was mere inches from the pristine commander's perfectly groomed visage, and when he finally spoke, it was not a shout. It was a dangerous, low-pitched, vibrating snarl that carried perfectly to every silent corner of the farmhouse. Patton informed the aristocrat, in remarkably clear, incredibly blunt, and deeply uncompromising language, that he was absolutely not a guest of the United States military, and he was certainly not an honorable soldier entitled to special privileges. Patton pointed a heavy, leather-gloved finger directly at the young American infantryman in the room, and fiercely reminded the commander that while he had been sitting in dry, luxurious chateaus, sipping fine wine and issuing orders that destroyed nations, these young boys had been bleeding in the freezing dirt, suffering unimaginable hardships just to put a permanent end to his sadistic, arrogant empire. The absolute audacity of demanding a warm, comfortable bed, while the victims of his military campaigns slept in flooded artillery craters, was a physical, repulsive insult to General Patton. He stared directly into the commander's eyes and delivered an order that would instantly become a legendary tale whispered among the ranks of the Third Army for generations to come. Patton slowly turned, walked to the open doorway, and pointed out into the freezing, driving rain toward a deep, heavily flooded drainage ditch running alongside the muddy supply road. It was a miserable, terrifying hole filled with a black, icy mixture of rainwater, heavy clay, and the toxic diesel runoff from passing military convoys. "You want a private room?" Patton growled, his voice cutting through the sound of the storm. "There it is. That ditch right there is your private quarters for the night. You will sit in that freezing water until the sun comes up, and you will eat the exact same cold, hard biscuits that my lowest-ranking privates eat. If the mud is good enough for the young men you tried to destroy, it is damn sure good enough for you." The psychological weight of those words hit the captured officer like a physical blow to the chest. The commander's face did not just go pale. It looked as though his entire soul had been instantly evacuated from his body. The shock was absolute and paralyzing. He tried desperately to protest, his voice losing its confident, highly educated rhythm, frantically claiming that such treatment was barbaric, humiliating, and a complete violation of his rights as a man of his station. But Patton was already turning his back and walking out the door, his point made, his justice delivered. The conversation was entirely over. The American military police in the room did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. They did not use velvet gloves or gentle persuasion. Suppressing wide, deeply satisfied smiles, they firmly grabbed the arms of that expensive, tailored woolen greatcoat and forcefully dragged the protesting commander out of the farmhouse and directly into the howling, freezing wind of the storm. His highly polished leather boots slipped and slid helplessly in the deep clay until they reached the very edge of the flooded pit. And with one final, forceful shove, the elite, untouchable aristocrat was sent tumbling down into the abyss. He splashed heavily into the freezing, thick brown sludge, his immaculate uniform completely ruined, soaked through with freezing mud in a single humiliating second. For the next 12 agonizing hours, the dark, freezing night became a psychological nightmare of cold, isolation, and profound realization for the man in the ditch. Every single time a heavy American transport truck or a massive armored tank rolled past his position on the road, it splashed more filthy, freezing water directly onto his face and shoulders. He sat there in the dark, shivering violently, completely uncontrollably, his gleaming metals sinking deeper into the muck with every passing hour. He was entirely exposed, completely stripped of his structural power, his military rank, and his carefully constructed illusion of superiority. For the first time in his entire privileged, highly sheltered existence, the master race was forcefully experiencing the exact same miserable, degrading, and helpless reality that they had enthusiastically forced upon the rest of the civilized world. He could not order a subordinate to bring him a warm woolen blanket. He could not demand respect from the armed guards standing above him. He was just a cold, wet, and thoroughly defeated human being sitting in a puddle of dirty water. The American sentries did not mock him or say a single word. They simply watched him with cold, indifferent eyes, which somehow made the psychological humiliation even more profound. He realized, slowly and with a terrifying, crushing clarity, as the freezing rain soaked deep into his skin, that his aristocratic bloodline, his grand titles, and his theoretical superiority meant absolutely nothing to the mud. The myth of his inherent greatness was violently washed away by the relentless storm, leaving only the hollow, shivering reality of a man who had lost his empire, his army, and finally, his pride. By the time the dull gray morning light finally broke across the shattered European horizon, the individual who was eventually pulled out of that freezing ditch was a completely hollow shell, fundamentally unrecognizable from the arrogant officer who had arrived the previous afternoon. His expensive, tailored uniform was a heavy, muddy rag, smelling strongly of diesel fuel and damp earth. His once rigid posture was completely broken, his shoulders slumped heavily forward in total, undeniable defeat. The arrogant, superior spark that had previously danced in his eyes had been completely extinguished, replaced only by a 1,000-yard stare of total psychological surrender. He did not ask for a private room anymore. He did not demand a warm bath, and he certainly did not ask for a glass of wine. When a young, exhausted American private casually handed him a cold, hard, tasteless biscuit from a military ration tin, the former aristocratic commander did not complain or cite international treaties. He simply took the biscuit with a trembling, filthy hand and ate it in absolute, devastating silence. Patton had not just punished him. Patton had completely broken his worldview. General Patton deeply understood a psychological truth that many bureaucratic leaders completely fail to grasp. Putting a fanatic or a deeply arrogant leader into a comfortable, dry jail cell only fuels their profound delusion. It allows them to maintain their sense of superiority, to sit in relative comfort and pretend that they are still fundamentally better than their captors. To truly break a monster, to truly dismantle a toxic ideology based on inherent supremacy, you have to physically strip away their insulation and make them intimately feel the exact same weight, the exact same discomfort, and the exact same misery of their own historical actions. Patton utilized his immense power and authority on that rainy afternoon not to protect the established privileges of the captured elite, but to level the playing field entirely, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the mud is the ultimate, undeniable equalizer. He sent a clear message that no man, regardless of his birthright, is inherently better than the common soldier who bleeds and suffers in the dirt to protect the world from tyranny. As we wrap up this intense, dark, and unfiltered chapter of historical conflict, I want to leave you with a profound question to ponder as you go about your safe, comfortable day. History is almost never written in completely clean, perfectly moral lines. It is forged in the mud, the rain, and the incredibly difficult decisions made under extreme duress. Did General Patton cross an unacceptable line by subjecting a surrendered officer to such degrading treatment? Or was this unorthodox, deeply humiliating punishment the absolute only way to truly defeat the toxic ego of a regime built on arrogant superiority? Would you have been the leader who signed the official paperwork to grant that commander his warm private room, to uphold the strict letter of international law? Or would you have been the leader who pointed directly to the freezing ditch? Let's get a real, unfiltered historical debate going in the comments section below. I want to read your genuine perspectives on justice, revenge, and wartime leadership. If this incredible story changed the way you view General Patton and the raw reality of the European theater, make sure you share this video with a friend who loves true history, hit that like button to support the channel, and ensure you are subscribed with notifications turned on for more raw, unfiltered, and completely untold stories from the darkest front lines of our past. Remember, history isn't just a collection of dates and treaties. It's about the intense human moments that prove who we really are when the civilized rules are stripped away. Until next time, keep questioning the official narratives and never stop seeking the truth.